When you edit it, can you Photoshop a mustache on your face again? Because I like that. I was expecting mustachio.
It's so hard to get away with. You know, my wife, she doesn't like it when I have a mustache. She likes me better without a mustache. So I feel like I steal a little bit of time. Like whenever I had to go to conventions, I could be like, yeah, but everybody expects me to have a mustache. So I'm going to try and, you know, any public appearance, I would try and grow it out. Just because that's how I draw myself, you know?
You need a persona. Well, I think of you fondly with the mustache. Actually, I had a mustache, maybe inspired by you, but when I was at the last TCAP, Steve Manali drew a thing with my mustache. I got a lot of positive coverage of my mustache that year.
Oh, man. Chester Brown said I look like Freddie Mercury last time I saw him at TCAP. I had a mustache. Let me show you my Doug Wright library, and you tell me if I'm missing anything, okay?
I have some stuff here, too, so I'll let you know.
All right, so I have the big Christmas present book. Right?
Yes.
The big masterpiece, volume
Thank
1.
You.
Right? Or is
Correct.
this volume
2? One.
So
it's like
volume
1. It continues of those books, of the little books. Mm-hmm. They were. It was the first of those, right? Okay. So it picks up the big book goes to 62, which is his mid-career, and then the idea that Chris had was to publish them in small versions. 2 years, right? And then kind of go through Wright's peak period to the end of, I guess really 70, 72 is probably the peak period. So you've got 2, where are the rest? Yeah, okay, 3, that's right. Yeah.
Number 3. And then
collect them all.
And then finally, number 3, right?
Yeah.
Or the 4th book you guys did. And that's it, right? There's no more after that.
See, the inspiration of those, if you want to go deep cuts, you can get like this.
Oh, I've never seen that.
Which is a little shot of Doug, or this one. So this is kind of, I believe, was Chris and Seth's inspiration. That's a wraparound drawing, which is kind of nice, right? I don't know if you can see this, but this would have been in the big book, I think. You know this, right?
Yeah.
Because the kids, and then this sums up. So I got these when I was a kid, because I knew Doug Wright strips when I was a kid, like a lot of Canadian kids did at that era, that generation. And my dad just brought these home for me one day. So Doug, I think, kind of either self-published these or published them through the syndicate that he worked with. And they have no spot color in them. But then the production's kind of not the best. But for the longest time, this is the only way you could get them. Yes, you have all of the new published stuff, but there are more little treasures if you seek them out as such. So yeah, that's those are the 4 ones, and it has a both Seth and Chris Oliveros and I are going to the plan is to publish a second volume, like a follow-up to that.
Yeah.
Right? We wanted to get it. We had plans to do it a couple of years ago. We actually took a trip down 2 or 3 years ago, Chris, Seth, and I, to the Wright family. Like, we visited Phyllis, who is Wright's widow. And then the kids, the boys, checked out because they had extra stuff. Most of his stuff after his death was donated to Library and Archives Canada, which is like our Library of Congress, which is here in Ottawa. So the original trips, we went there and found everything, but they still have stuff here. So we went through kind of letters and stuff with the idea of rounding it out to have a second volume that would kind of cover the strips that were in the small books.
Yeah.
Those are part of it as well. So that's kind of peak Wright, but it also delve into, the mid part of his career and then the end of his life, which is kind of tragic, right? Like there's some broad kind of poetic parts to his life that are interesting that I've always wanted to kind of finish. So it's a little, it wasn't the plan to publish it, a decade and a bit apart, but it's just the nature of, there's a lot of things that went into that in terms of like publishing choices and the format of it and the year it came out, which is right around the big mortgage meltdown, the financial crisis, global financial crisis.
That's right.
That hampered it. It was basically the cover price wasn't enough to cover, so we could have sold the complete run and it still wouldn't have been enough to cover what was invested in it. But what we're going to do is like a crowdfunder, like a Kickstarter,
Okay.
which the plan is to have that kick off at the next Doug Wright Awards. And there'll be a ton of great stuff in there. Like the depth of, he was such a prodigious, he would put out so much, like just strictly on his art. Like, you know, I found, actually I have a cool thing here. I should have shown this to you before. I just got this in the mail. Hang on. But there are strips called, I mean, I feel like Doug Wright's Family was his heart and soul. Like that's what he did and was known for. But he took over this strip called Bird's Eye Center that got turned into Juniper Junction. That is amazing. That would be great to be published. Seth, of course, I read the whole run of that because Seth collected them out of old magazines and newspapers and bound them like a lunatic. So I've read it there. He did a strip called The Wheels, which is just, again, just drawings of cars. He did one called Max and Minnie, another one called Ticky Tacky Township. That's like in the 70s. It's kind of a little sketchy, but so that'll all be included. It's more than just Doug Wright stuff, right? Okay. And then you'll also have stuff he did. Like he did these prints of old cars from the 20s and 60s, race cars and stuff. And some company published them as prints you could buy. Maybe I don't know where you bought them anyways. So hopefully some of those will be in there because those are friggin' gorgeous. He was just such a great draftsman. You know what I mean? It didn't matter what he was doing. You know, but I think if in a perfect world, like when you look at his journals, which Seth, when you read his journals, he's just, Phyllis was nice enough to lend those to us so we could flip through them and read them. When you read them, it's like you can tell, even though he loves the strip and that brings him, he just loves cars and vehicles. He would apparently like hang out at, you know, places where trucks were and stuff and talk to the guys about the trucks and the mechanics of it. Like he'd probably be happy, you know, just being like some sort of technical artist or something. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
As opposed to being this chronicler of mid-century life that we all look at now and we're just like, oh yeah. So like what I love about him so much and what I talk about in the book a bit, I think, is that he, because of his attention to detail, he would literally look out his window and draw stuff. Like the first time Seth and I went to visit that house in Burlington, Ontario, which is just south of, not far from Guelph, where Seth and Tanya live, but we went to visit the address of the house where most of the stuff was drawn. It's like you would turn around from the driveway and look, and it was like, I know that house. I know that, this mid-60 kind of ranch and split level. Because he would literally look out his window and draw stuff. And he would draw neighbors in, like, so neighbors that he knew, because it kind of had supporting characters to some degree. Like there were like kids in the neighborhood. It was like a goofy bucktooth kid in some of the strips. And that was a kid that the sons know, because we know the sons, and they'd say that. And so he was literally drawing from life. And the early stuff, when he would draw the mom going to like the grocery store or a mall, he would go and drive and go to a mall and like draw the mall. You know what I mean? So there's this weird historical legacy along the way of that era of mid-century Montreal and Toronto and kind of the surrounding area. So that's a big part of it, I think, as well, of the appeal. It's like a time capsule. Yeah,
I read in your writing about how he became like kind of a local hero around the town, and they all knew like, oh, that's the artist, and they knew, since the housewives knew he was home working all day, they would have him come and help fix up, retie a clothing line or something you wrote, and
Yeah. He was always being kind of like, he was always being dragged in because it was weird to have somebody at home, a man at home. So he would go and like fix stuff and help fix kids' stuff. And I feel like I've been so immersed in all the stuff. And then I feel like I have a pretty, maybe the most fully rounded version of the man, because I got it from his personal writings. I got it from Phyllis, who was like a second mother to me. Like, she's a saint. She's so great. And from his sons, and then other people that knew him, because I think I used some of those interviews. I've done interviews that I did 10 years ago that I'll probably use in this one too, where I couldn't fit into the book for whatever reason about his life and his expectations and stuff. But yeah, he was I think for a mid-century guy of that era, that I know I talk about this in the book, but I'm still fascinated by the fact that he didn't have a dad. Like, he never knew his dad. He was a baby basically when his dad died. And I think about that a lot, maybe because I have kids or whatever. And the fact that he ends up becoming this guy who's like his most well-known contribution to the art form that he's found himself in is basically this suburban, suburban dad thing with all the goofiness that comes around. It's, it's because that's not necessarily a reflection of him, full, like it was a character was him, but we're all multidimensional, right? And you can only have room to kind of show one aspect, he got angry sometimes, you know what I mean, at his kids. And, I guess you see that in fits and starts in the comics. So I wanted to show you this. It's only because it just arrived in the very early days of, I think before it was even called Nipper. It was published in England and some places in the States, but it went by different names. And this was one of them, which is Charlie Boy. So these are just some clippings. This is from, I don't know what paper it was from, but there were all these different names. There's another one that says Charlie Boy. Part of the reason I got these was because they were cheap, and also because my youngest son is named Charlie. So that's the original idea. So once I got to know him, and he, invited me out to Guelph to, go around his apartment there and see all of his stuff. Like, he did that to kind of lure me in and ingratiate himself to me with the idea of pitching this book that would have been called The Gang of Seven, which was his kind of view of Canadian cartooning from the turn of the century the 20th century, basically, ending with Doug Wright's death. And it would include people like Jimmy Fries and George Fair, who I wrote about. First time I heard about George Fair, Peter Wally, and these other guys who I'd never really heard about. But the one person in that whole thing that I'd forgotten about at that point, this would have been in the mid-2000s, 2003, was Doug Wright. And that, like, a totally, like, as soon as he was showing me like these books, particularly this one, I was like, holy shit, I totally forgotten. And at that point, we didn't have kids yet. So this one was so indelible in my memory that this strip, that panel, which is now in a kind of a gatefold, I had absorbed this image of, because I have an older brother. And so whenever I would have read this in the 70s or whatever, I thought this actually happened in my family. Like this thing where the kids are throwing rocks in, and then dad comes to a station wagon that was like that. And where this thing happened, and it was actually throwing rocks. And there were a couple other stories that over time, because I didn't have these books in front of me, they were in a box somewhere at my parents' house. I thought that happened to me. And then so that shows you, like, as a kid, like how you, because there's no writing in it, it's, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. It absorbs somehow instinctually. And then over the decades, it was like, oh, this happened to me. And I remember telling my mom and dad, and they were like, I don't ever remember that happening. I'm like, oh man, that's a sign of what a good cartoonist is. So yeah, anyways, when he pitched it to me, we went around and we went to a few publishers, and he did up sketches, and stuff. And like, this is the idea. Gang of Seven is a riff on the Group of Seven, which is a super famous, iconic group of artists in Canada. So the Gang of Seven was supposed to be like a version of that, with cartooning, kind of the lower art or whatever. And it didn't really gain any traction. But I think we also presented it to Chris. And then Chris was like, I don't care about those other artists, but I do a book on Doug Wright, right? So that's basically where it came from. So we focused the book. It's so heartening to see that somebody in a different country, America particularly, which is, cultural behemoth in terms of Canada, right? Yeah. This huge elephant could even turn around and like pay attention to this book, much less appreciate its artistic merits. That alone is a victory for me, anyways.
Oh, it's such amazingly crisp, like beautiful artwork, and what I admire about it as like an artist is that the way he uses red, like it's like such a beautiful lush drawing, but then he'll just put red where he wants you to look, like that. How smart that is, just to get the gag. It's just smart. It's great.
This is why when you see them in this is, where you see the cover, but these don't have the spot red. And I think he writes about being frustrated they didn't reprint them. So that's why when we did it in the big book and the little books, we made a point of adding the red, even though it's obviously, jacks up the production costs. But yeah, and in the early ones that we saw at Library and Archives, he experimented with like yellow and different colors and eventually settled on red. I love the imagery of that too, because the Canadian flag is red and white, right? Like there's so many. I doubt that's where he was coming from, but it's a nice little that he settled into this red spot color. And it's also very hard. Like, I don't know if you realize in some of the Peep Show comics. Joe tried that, right? And failed miserably by his own admission. Like he would paint the tongues red or something. It wouldn't make any sense. Like he thought, I think Seth said, or Joe told me that he thought that Joe was like, well, I'm only gonna put red on something that's actually red. So your tongue is red or pink, so I'll make it red. Like it doesn't work at all. I want to look at your tongue. Like
yeah, he's missing the whole point. He's Doug Wright is showing you visually which characters you're supposed to pay attention to in this crowd of people. What quality do you see in Doug Wright's comics that is so uniquely Canadian?
What is so Canadian about them? That's a really good point. There is something that's uniquely Canadian. Well, there's a lot of stuff like wearing a Montreal Canadiens or a Toronto Maple Leafs jersey, or time of year stuff, like playing hockey, playing ice hockey and stuff that would only really identify to people who live in Canada or maybe Wisconsin or close to the border where hockey is a tradition. So it's not like I don't think he ever purposely tried not to do it. I mean, in some of them there's French signs and stuff, you know what I mean? But yeah, there is just a tone and tenor of a time and place which is so specific. I see the appeal, but I can only speak for myself. I can't see the appeal for anybody else. I know that when the book came out and when the little books came out, I'd get my author copies, particularly the little books, and I just would trade them around the neighborhood to my friends and who had little kids who maybe couldn't read, and they love them. Like kids love them, like because it's honest in the end, above whether it's Canadian or American or middle class or suburban or white or not white. He got really down to the kind of unvarnished truth of stuff, right? Like he saw it and he wrote it. And some of them, as you see, like are extreme. Like he's really losing his shit, Like, the kids can be demons,
Yeah, it's true. Are the kids bald, or do they have hair that's so light that he just didn't color it?
No, well, I hate to, it's, I think they were just buzz cuts, I think was the idea. The little baby though, or this Charlie boy guy had a bit of hair, but it was supposed to, I'm not sure how much he was inspired by, well, he debuted before Schultz, before Peanuts, right? So he wasn't trying to rip off, he was aggrieved by that people compared him to, like he was trying to rip off Peanuts. And he was like, not at all.
I don't
first
see
Peanuts isn't about kids really, so yeah.
I don't see him as a Charlie Brown type character, or even strip. I think it's a totally different kind of comic. I think it's more, if it's anything, it's Dennis the Menace. That'd be the closest comparison. It's just little kids being mean. I mean, the little kids aren't philosophizing or anything. They're just running around being kids. Well, no.
Yeah, the idea of this being kids, I mean, it could have been anything. He just chose it's not kids. It's a philosophical comedy, if anything. They're basically adults. Like, no. Any sane person wouldn't look at Peanuts and be like, "Oh, these are kids." Like, no, they're not kids. Kids don't talk or think that way at all. They're not concerned about. Any kid I know is not concerned about the existence of God. No, but the answer to your question is, you always imagine those as those are buzz cuts, right? Yeah. Like kids in the 50s and 60s just got their head beamed. Like you just shave it really closely. And then I think over time it was just easier not to draw that. It was too visually distracting to try and draw a little bit of hair, so you just made it bald. And it looks bald, but
yeah, was that Chris Ware pointed out that like a bald character with like very little kind of definable features is the perfect cartoon character because the reader automatically inserts themselves into this drawing?
It's probably him. Yeah, I mean that probably says something. And there's certainly a history of bald-headed comic characters between Henry, Wright, and Nipper and Charlie Brown, and we could keep going. All bald boys, I should say. The cleaner and more simplistic, the better. But I wish I could dig out some of my art. Like you see his art is just flawless. It's crazy to think of how, I remember when we saw those Joe Ullman, I think I was showing him some art. It's just meticulous like that. I don't think he did work with he worked with a pen, probably a nib or something, but it's just so meticulous. It's you can see how much. So like I said, the draftsman side of it is in and of itself something to appreciate, But yeah, I don't know.
No assistance or anything? He did it all himself?
No, he did everything himself, which is crazy. But you can see in some of the other strips, it's a little looser. He tried to adopt a looser style, and even as he got on in the comics. when it gets into the 70s and stuff, there's actually here's, as I was just talking, I looked, there's a very, you can't help it but make it Canadian. There's a kid sledding, or tobogganing as we call it up here. And then there's another one here where it was like a kid watching like a football game in the cold. I think it's a football game. This is another one that I thought that actually happened to me as a kid. We have the CFL up here, the Canadian Football League, which are often, the playoff games are usually in winter. And that one has a little kid sitting there like, being all wrapped up to watch. And I'm pretty sure that happened in my head. I thought, well, that happened to me. And my dad was like, I never took you to 8 football games. It's like, oh.
Is it a Canadian quality that he would have it as a silent comic so that he could sell it to Quebec?
100%.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
That was intentional to have it wordless. But to be honest with you, when he tries to put words into his strip, it doesn't work like as much. He's lost the magic somehow because he was such a visually driven guy, right? So I think it was like a challenge to how to visually, but I think that was a conscious choice early on. So Montreal in the 50s, or whenever, 49, 50, when he started, it was still very Anglophone, so very English focused. But, it was a mix of all different cultures, particularly French. That was all prior to when Canada became a bilingual country, right? So he had a strong, but he was very clear, even though he wanted the paper to either appear in a French publication or English publication across Canada, so any kid or any adult could read it. And they would change stuff, I think, it was called Fistu, I think. And then they would change some of the signs and stuff. He would do a little overlay and change it to arrête or something instead of stop.
Yeah, I saw that as a good example that was reprinted in the book. And then you also wrote about how one of the newspapers that it was printing it removed his name because it sounded too English.
That happened to my dad. My parents are both from Montreal, and he couldn't get work because around the time of the Quiet Revolution is what it was called. So my mom and dad were both born. My dad was born in 1939, and I grew up in Montreal, and my mom was born in Montreal. They met there. My older brother was born there, and they moved in the mid 60s, like a lot of Anglophones did, English-speaking Anglophones, because there was this thing called the Quiet Revolution, which was basically, Francophones who were kind of generally considered lower class in Montreal, I think. And you had people who are more Anglophone. It's kind of a class thing more than a race thing. It's not, calling French and English Anglophone, Francophone race is not really appropriate, more of a class thing. But they had this kind of growing intellectual resistance to the idea that they had to. So the Quiet Revolution was basically a cultural and societal revolution that was effectively bloodless. But what that meant is that, people like Doug Wright and my dad were stigmatized for having names that were Anglophone. It was considered a bad thing to have an English name. So my name, Mackay, is Scottish. That's where my grandfather was from. So, even my dad, as an example, would go to places to get a job and would be told, listen, you're great, and I would have hired you 5 years ago, but your name is literally too English. It's not a good look now to hire you. So my dad moved to Ottawa, which is a couple hours down the road, and settled here, and this is where I was born. The same thing happened to Doug Wright, and he was, I'm not sure, I can't remember how much I got into in the book, but it'll definitely come into the second one. Like, it changed him. Like, he was like, I'm done. There's a whole sequence when he decides to leave. When he decides to leave, which is like 66, 67. Did I write about this? I can't remember. It was like a big middle finger. Like it was one of the few things where he had a sequence in the book. I think I wrote about it in one of the little books, but I'll expand on it in the volume 2. Is he basically, we're leaving, and it was like a week's worth of strips where it was like a big, basically, F you, and he did like a postcard or a Christmas card that he sent out. It was basically the whole family, the Doug Wright family, driving away with a sign that says, you're now leaving Quebec, Yeah, it really animated a lot of his feelings about Quebec, and like, I'd never go back there. And
when he moved away, he got a new job that only paid $30 a week for his comic.
Yeah. And he didn't tell his wife, I think.
Yeah. Like, this is furious. Like,
yeah, Phyllis, I think we asked her about that. And she's like, oh, I wasn't very pleased. But in his nature, like, he got other jobs, he got advertising gigs, and and he did, he got all these, he made and got other, like he got this kind of, for lack of a better word, like a weekly political cartoon, and kind of made his mark. It was most things when you make those moves, it worked out. Like the timing, I think, was right. So I meant to tell you before, because I just came into my head. I meant to say before. So when Steph and I went to visit when we were maybe working on the book, or we were working on the book. I think we had met Phyllis, but we found out like the address on Rankin Drive in Burlington, right? Like to go to where his house was, where he drew the majority of his strips before the family home, basically. A nice little suburban neighborhood. And so we checked it out. We were outside, we're taking photos of each other, and back before phones was clearly a camera. And like a few weeks later, both Seth and I got this call from the RCMP, which is like our kind of our FBI, I guess, for lack of a better word. The RCMP, obviously, Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Were you at 341 Rankin Drive or whatever on this date, and why were you? And I think Seth got the call first, then he called me. He's like, "You gonna call you?" I'm like, "No." So basically, what happened is that somebody in that house was in the witness protection program.
Oh,
right. I think that's what it was. They were in the witness protection program, and then they saw some guy dressed in like, it looks like a private eye from 1948, sad. And some other, I was just a normal looking guy who's probably had a ball cap on or something. And we're standing up front and taking photos and like looking at it and pointing. So I guess the person in that house like got nervous and thought we were there to kill him or something. What were you going to say before I cut you off with my random?
I wanted to know about what that was like. Like you guys decided you're going to do this Doug Wright series, and then all of a sudden you're like, well, how do we, did you like all of a sudden find out like, oh, his wife is still alive? Like, holy shit, let's go talk to her. How did that discovery happen?
So I think we knew her. I'm trying to piece it together. I should have done this before. I think so I got to know Seth. He had the idea for the book. And then somewhere along the lines, I think we'd already reached out to Phil and talked with her and met her. And, she's really nice when she gets to know you, but she's pretty suspicious, right? Like, who are these guys trying to, so we had to kind of win her over. And part of that process was the Doug Wright Awards, I think, right? Which I should really call her a founding member of the Doug Wright Awards of anybody else, because she's been, she's had to sit through so many profane, insane, presentations at that awards that, anyway, she's great. But I think, so we had been kind of talking about it. We went to visit her in one of her places and saw the art, and we were kind of telling her we would do something. And then I had the idea to do a Canadian comic book awards ceremony, because I've been to TCAF and the first TCAF, and I thought it was really great. And then I talked to Seth, and he agreed to help design the trophies, and I got the categories. And then we thought about different names, and Doug Wright just seemed like a natural one. This is before the book was even in, there was any sort of contract for the book, I think. So that helped, I think, broker the relationship with Phyllis. And I just went from there. So naming it after the awards, inducting him in first, and then seeing that kind of grow. And then the book came out in 2009. I think the awards have been up and going for a few years, right, by then. Yeah, so the good thing is, like I said, is that he kept all of his stuff for the most part. And then it's not like this George Fayer guy where his art's kind of in the wind, you know what I mean? He saw it as very temporal. He didn't really hang on to it. Doug hung on to his stuff, and they had a bunch of it, but he had so much that they couldn't really handle it, so they donated it to Library and Archives Canada. So there's a fund, as they call it, right? There's like an archive there of his stuff. So that was, once we knew that, after reading Phyllis, she had tons of stuff as well. But once knowing that there was stuff there, now they hadn't archived it yet. They hadn't gotten around to actually recording it. So we had to go, and I remember Chris and one of his sons, Miguel, I think, and Seth and I going to Ottawa, where it is, and like putting on the white gloves and looking through it. I think they've archived it now, so you can actually go on digitally. But we got all of that stuff. We still have all of that stuff. So Drawn and Quarterly paid for all of that stuff to get scanned, high quality scans and sent. So we have all those digital files. So that'll help us with volume 2, because we still have those digital files from 12 years ago or whatever it was, 12, 13 years ago when we worked on it. So, and then she had stuff as well. she kept his diary / logbooks. That was super insightful. Letters that she kept back home, ephemera, and then just tons of, as you would imagine, just in terms of writing the bio, is just tons of research.
What is that logbook that you just had earlier on your desk? Is that his diary or something, or what?
So this is not the original one. It was just, Phil lent it to us, and Seth had it photocopied so we could use it as it's not intended for publication. It was just used as a resource material for us. So you can look at it and see when he's angry at somebody who hasn't paid him, or angry at a neighbor or something. And then it also is good because it has kind of a list of different strips he did and dates. So you can kind of go back and say, okay, that was published then. Occasionally there's like a little drawing, you know what I mean? Little drawing when it's the end of the year. He's drawing a little hands clapping or something like that. So yeah, when you start looking through it, it's kind of like, okay, well, it would give you an idea of when he, when kind of his day-to-day life, you know what I mean? He would get up, have a coffee, and blah, 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 go visit some friends and talk about finances and the whole 9 yards. So yeah, it was great that she had it, because that's, it's not a diary per se. He's not writing about, there's no deep thoughts in it. He's not got written poems or stuff, but it's kind of like, it's actually very Doug Wright, to be kind of like, writing kind of just daily observations and things. Very kind of, kind of clinical about it.
And Seth he had those books made?
He just went and he photocopied the pages, and then he went and just got them bound.
That is awesome.
Right? Yeah. I mean, oh yeah, and it's also got a little, I don't know. You'd probably forgotten to even have these. It has a little ex libris. A little ex libris, like anybody else could have done this. Like,
yeah.
Oh, I wonder who bound all of these photocopies of, Canadian cartoonists. I wonder what Canadian cartoonist that was. Was it Chester? Was it Pascal Girard? I wonder. I don't know who to return it to. Anyways, listen, I have to go pick up my wife, but I'm gonna. Oh, okay. I'll be done.
Oh, that's fine. Yeah. I took a lot of your time anyway. I understand, but.
If you draw about people that win all of the time, you're drawing only about the minority.